The last light of summer was bleeding out across the San Juan Mountains, washing the granite cliffs in a copper-rose glow. The air, once searing in the afternoon, had cooled into a sharp, brittle breeze that whispered through the ponderosa pines, carrying the resin sweetness mixed with the dry sting of sagebrush. A cicada rasped somewhere in the timber, its rhythm echoing against the canyons. The trail beneath Ranger Evelyn Hart's boots was little more than a deer track, dust rising like smoke at each step of Storm's hooves. To anyone else, this forgotten path would be nothing, but to Evelyn, it was a vein she knew by heart, every bend, every scar where fire once gnawed at bark, etched in her memory. Evelyn sat tall in the saddle, her lean frame molded by years of patrol. The mountain sun had kissed her skin bronze, leaving fine lines at the corners of her steady eyes, eyes that carried both patience and storms of their own. Her dark hair, streaked with gold, was tied back in a simple knot. No vanity, only function. The khaki ranger uniform she wore was faded at the elbows, her badge dulled from rain and ash. Just a year ago, the whole town had watched her stagger out of a wildfire's black smoke, with half-burned sleeves and a herd of mule deer driven to safety. She hadn't boasted, hadn't sought applause, but from that night on, when Evelyn spoke, even the most stubborn ranchers fell silent. Beside her moved Storm, her weather-worn gray gelding. His mane tossed in the wind, ragged and untamed, his muscles shifting beneath his coat with each deliberate stride. Storm was no show horse bred for ribbons. He was a survivor, a creature that had outrun lightning and carried his rider through firestorms. Together, woman and horse pressed deeper into the timber, following a path that by all accounts shouldn't have existed. Then Evelyn saw it, a clearing, hushed and strange, the pines leaning in like watchmen. In the center sat a rust-choked cage. Inside, 3 foals huddled together, their legs trembling, their eyes wide with a terror older than their young bodies should have known. A piece of cardboard dangled from the bars, scrawled in black marker, $1 each. The sign swung in the mountain wind like a cruel joke. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. At first, she thought this was just another rescue, another sad tale of neglect. But as Storm snorted and pawed at the ground, she sensed something else. A wrongness that went deeper than cruelty. What she and her horse had stumbled upon wasn't simply an act of human carelessness. It was the first thread of a much darker tapestry hidden beneath the forest floor, one that, once unraveled, would reveal a secret no ranger was ever meant to uncover. And before the night was over, Evelyn would realize that she hadn't just found 3 abandoned foals. She had opened a door that someone powerful would kill to keep shut. A scar ran along his left flank, a reminder of the same wildfire that had scarred Evelyn. Together they had outrun collapsing timbers and walls of flame, and since that day there existed between them a placed bond not easily explained in words. Storm was more than transport. He was a partner. He seemed to read Evelyn's smallest shift of weight, the slightest pressure of her heel, the whisper of a command that never needed to be spoken aloud. His instincts were keen, sharper than any compass. Evelyn trusted them because in this land of hidden dangers, sometimes the horse noticed what the human could not. The sun's arc dipped lower shadows, stretching like dark fingers across the trail. Evelyn loosened her shoulders, preparing for the turn that would eventually carry her back toward the ranger station before night fully claimed the forest. Storm's ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again. Then he stopped. Not slowed, stopped. His hooves dug into the earth body, stiffening nostrils flaring wide. A sharp snort burst from him, followed by a stomp of his foreleg that cracked the soil. Evelyn's back straightened at once. Storm did not halt without cause. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, though she already recognized the signs. The horse's head lifted high, ears locked forward, eyes bright with focus. His breath came quick, sucking in scents invisible to her. Then came the sound, a short, sharp whinny higher than his usual call, edged with urgency. Evelyn had heard it before. Once near an old bear den, once on the ridge where she had found a poacher's snare. It was Storm's way of saying danger, wrongness, something out of place. The air itself seemed to tighten. The peaceful hush of evening no longer felt gentle, but strained, as if the forest held its breath. Evelyn scanned the trees. Nothing obvious. No smoke, no animal cry, no movement. Yet she felt the shift, too. "Easy," she said, sliding a hand down Storm's neck. But her own heartbeat had quickened. She let the horse lead, trusting his senses. Storm veered off the main trail, pushing into a thicket where branches clawed at Evelyn's sleeves. The ground dipped soft with pine needles, and the light grew dimmer. She ducked low beneath the boughs, gripping the reins loosely, allowing Storm to follow the scent that had triggered his alarm. The forest swallowed sound. Only the creak of saddle leather, the steady thump of hooves, and the throb of her pulse filled Evelyn's ears. Then the brush thinned, revealing a patch of flattened earth hidden beneath the canopy. She saw it immediately. A cage, rusted iron bars, square and ugly, crouched beneath the pines like a forgotten trap. It was large enough for deer, perhaps, or wolves, but its door sagged open, held by a crude chain. The late light slanted through the trees and struck the metal, making it gleam red-brown. Storm blew air hard through his nose, muscles bunching. Evelyn swung down from the saddle boots, crunching on dry needles. She moved closer, each step deliberate. The cage had not been here long. She could tell by the way the undergrowth was trampled, grass bent, and broken earth, pressed down by heavy tires. Someone had dragged it in recently, hidden it in. Haste, and inside her throat tightened. 3 foss lay crumpled together. They were small, no more than a few months, each their bodies angular with hunger. Chains looped crew around their slender legs, tethering them to the bars. Their coats were dull, matted with sweat and grime. Their ribs writhed beneath skin. Eyes that should have been wide and curious were sunken, dulled by exhaustion. One lifted its head a fraction, then let it drop again as if the effort cost too much. They made no sound, no whicker, no plea, only shallow breaths. Evelyn's gaze caught on a piece of cardboard, nailed crookedly to the bars. Black marker scrolled across it in crude letters, $1 each. Her stomach lurched. $1. As though these living creatures were no more than scraps to be bartered worthless unless someone happened to toss a coin. For a moment, she stood frozen, rage and sorrow tangling in her chest. Then her jaw set. Storm shifted closer, placing his body between her and the tree's ears, still swiveling wearily. He would guard. She would act. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside the cage. From her belt, she pulled the small set of tools every ranger carried. Pliers, wire cutters, things for mending fences or prying open old locks. Her hands were steady, though her breath came fast. With a grunt, she snapped the padlock. The chain fell away with a hollow clink. The door creaked open. She entered, slowly, murmuring softly to the foes, though she knew they were too weak to rise in panic. "It's all right. Easy now. I've got you." One by one, she worked at the shackles. The metal was crude edges, biting into raw skin. She cursed under her breath, snapping each with the cutters, careful not to jerk too hard. When the last chain fell, she coaxed the quote, "nearest F out," its staggered legs trembling. Evelyn slid an arm under its chest, guiding it gently. The second followed, larger but sluggish head drooping against her shoulder. She pressed her cheek to its coarse mane. "Come on, big one, you're safe now." The smallest lingered at the back, eyes wide, whole body shivering. Evelyn crouched low, hand outstretched. Storm stepped closer to the entrance, lowering his great head, snorting softly. The foe's ears flicked slowly, as if drawn by some unspoken trust. It edged forward and pressed its narrow face against Evelyn's arm. She swallowed the lump in her throat and eased it free. In the fading light, she studied them, searching for names for identity beyond the cruelty stamped on that sign. The dark one, with a sharp, weary gaze. Ash, a creature of soot and vigilance, as though he carried embers in his eyes. The round-bellied colt who leaned against her with doxal heaviness blaze. Not fire of destruction, but warmth, stubborn and enduring, and the smallest delicate as a reed, trembling but resilient enough to have survived this far. Willow, she whispered their names aloud, sealing them like promises. Ash blinked slowly. Blaze gave a faint snort and Willow tucked her nose into the crook of Evelyn's neck. Evelyn straightened her arms, aching from supporting their frail weight. She glanced at Storm, who stood tall, shadow, stretching long across the earth. "From now on," she said softly, voice fierce with vow, "no one puts a price tag on you, not one of you ever." Again, the forest did not answer, but the wind stirred the branches overhead, carrying her words into the darkening sky. The ride back to the station was slow, deliberate, and heavy with the silence. Storm moved at a cautious walk, keeping his gray body close to the 3 foes, as though he were a sentinel posted at their flanks. Evelyn guided them with a patience born of years on the trail, but even she felt her breath hitch at the sight. The little ones staggered and wobbled with each step, their legs thin and shaky, their heads drooping. Evening had settled into the forest. The temperature dropped, and the once warm wind carried a chill that raised goose flesh on her arms. The pines seemed taller, darker now, pressing in, as if the woods themselves were watching this fragile procession. She kept speaking softly to the foe's words, not meant to be understood, but to soothe. Almost there, just a little farther. Ash. Keep moving. Blaze. Willow. Steady now. Steady. Storm's ears flicked back each time she spoke, as though reassuring himself as well. He would edge closer whenever Willow faltered, lowering his great head. So, the filly brushed against him, drawing courage from his presence. By the time the ranger station came into sight, the sky was a velvet blue, fading into shadow. A single lantern glowed outside the wooden outbuilding, the small structure looking more like a caretaker's cabin than an official office. Evelyn swung, opened the gate to the paddock, leading them inside. She had prepared makeshift quarters, countless times before for injured deer, orphaned elk calves, even the occasional cougar cub brought in by frightened hunters. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she was not tending to wild things plucked by accident from nature. She was sheltering creatures whose suffering had been manufactured, deliberate, orchestrated by human greed. Inside the small barn beside the office, she spread a thick layer of hay onto the ground, piling it higher near the back wall to keep them warm. The foe sank into it almost at once, their legs folding awkwardly as they collapsed with exhausted relief. Evelyn fetched water, tilting the bucket carefully so each could lap without spilling too much. Ash's eyes flicked toward every sound, still suspicious, while Blah one gulped greedily, and Willow pressed so close to Storm's legs that she nearly tripped over her own hooves. Evelyn crouched nearby, one hand resting on her knee, watching them breathe. In the dim lantern glow, their coats seemed duller, their ribs sharper. She clenched her jaw. She had seen cruelty before, but rarely this brazen. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed. "Caroline, I need you here. 3 Foss bad condition. Bring everything." Dr. Caroline Vega arrived less than half an hour later, her SUV headlights cutting across the paddock. She stepped out with the briskness of someone who had answered too many late-night calls, her tall frame outlined against the beam. At 42, she carried herself with a practiced authority. Dark hair was coiled into a tight bun, stray strands glinting silver in the lamplight, and her hazel eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She grabbed a heavy canvas bag from the back seat, its bulging shape betraying. Syringes, stethoscopes, and bandages within. A flashlight dangled from her belt, bouncing as she strode across the yard. Evelyn met her at the door. 3 Foss malnourished, chained when I found them. Caroline's gaze softened briefly before hardening again. "Show me." Together, they entered the barn. The smell of hay mixed with something sour, the lingering stench of neglect. Caroline knelt without hesitation, her gloves snapping tight against her wrists. She started with Blaze, the largest. The foe hardly stirred as she slipped a thermometer beneath his tail, checked gums, pried lips apart to study teeth. The light from her pen torch gleamed against his dull eyes. She frowned, fingers pressing along his flank. Pulses weak, dehydrated, malnourished. Then she ran her hands slowly down his back, pausing as her fingers traced tiny, raised bumps. Her brow furrowed. She parted the hair, revealing small puncture marks, fresh and raw. "Not an accident," she muttered. Evelyn crouched closer. "Injections, yes." Caroline's voice was tight. "And not vaccines. Look at the pattern. Multiple sites along the spine. Whoever did this wasn't treating illness. They were pumping something into him." She pulled a slim UV pen from her kit, clicked it on, and swept the beam over the foe's side. A faint unnatural glow bloomed beneath the skin, greenish and sickly. Caroline hissed under her breath. Growth hormones, synthetic enhancers. Evelyn's gut twisted to bulk them faster. Caroline nodded grimly. "Cheap breeders. Use it when they want quick results. Muscles fill out sooner, coats shine brighter for a while, until the liver gives out." She moved to Ash next. The colt flicked his ears and shifted suspicious even in exhaustion. Caroline murmured to calm him, then lifted his hoof. The underside bore a faint carved groove, shallow but intentional numbers. She looked up sharply. They marked him. She checked Blaz's hooves 2 deeper. Cuts this time, as though someone had pressed harder with a knife. Willow's were different. The grooves had started to heal, leaving small scars. Caroline exhaled slowly, her face grim. They were being catalogued. Lot numbers for an auction. The words hung in the air heavy. Evelyn stood stiff, her fists curling at her sides. Storm shifted restlessly behind her, sensing the tension. Caroline stripped off one glove, running a tired hand across her forehead. Evelyn, these aren't strays. This isn't random neglect. These foes came from a system, a pipeline. She rose to her full height, meeting Evelyn's eyes. They were bred, injected, marked, and prepped for sale. They belonged to an illegal horse trafficking ring. For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. She only pressed her hand to Storm's neck, feeling the horse's breath against her arm, steady and strong. Her silence was not disbelief. It was fury restrained. Storm lifted his head suddenly, ears, pricking toward the barn door. His nostrils flared, inhaling sharply. Then, he let out a deep huff. Evelyn turned. The gray gelding stepped forward, almost pulling against his reins, though he wasn't tethered. He nudged her side once and then moved to the corner where several sacks lay, stacked things Evelyn had hauled from the site of the cage-torn feed bags, scraps of rope debris she had collected for evidence. Storm pressed his nose into them, snorted hard, then jerked his head back, pawing the ground. His eyes rolled, white, his body tense. He snorted again, a sharp, angry sound, and stomped his hoof with a crack that echoed against the wooden walls. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, already. Moving closer. She crouched, tugged one of the sacks open. Inside was a tangle of hay, dirt, and scraps. But as she sifted through, a bitter, acrid odor stung her nose. A dusting of powder clung to the fibers, faint but pungent chemical and harsh. Caroline leaned over, inhaled once, and recoiled. Same compound, same as what's in there. Blood. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Storm pawed again, tails swishing violently. He recognized at the same stench from the cage. His whole body radiated agitation, a warning Evelyn trusted more than any lab test. She tied the sack closed again, setting it aside like a piece of damning evidence. The barn seemed smaller, darker now, the lantern light flickering against the walls. Caroline stripped off, her gloves, her movements sharp. She met Evelyn's gaze, her voice low but firm. "Listen to me. This wasn't some farmer cutting corners. These foes were headed for something bigger. They've already been through the first steps of conditioning. If I had to guess, they were bound for a black market auction. They were prepared merchandise, products that didn't make it to the block." Her words struck like iron. Evelyn lifted her head slowly, eyes narrowing with resolve. Storm stood beside her sides, heaving nostrils still, twitching with fury. The foes lay in their nest of hay, breathing shallowly, 3 fragile lives, pulled back from the edge, but scarred with the evidence of what had been done. And in the stillness of the barn, Evelyn felt the truth solidify. This was not the end of the trail, but its beginning. The sheriff's office sat on Main Street like a relic of another time. An old, timber building with weathered siding, a peaked roof, and a front porch shaded by cottonwoods. Its sign, Silver Mesa Sheriff's Department, hung slightly crooked above the door. At night, the windows glowed amber, a beacon for the sleepless, the restless, and the troubled. Evelyn tied Storm to the post outside. The FO were bedded down at the Ranger station, with Caroline standing watch, but Storm refused to be left behind. He shifted his weight ears, swiveling uneasy in town, yet unwilling to part from her. Evelyn stroked his neck once before stepping inside. The air in the office smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. A wood stove squatted cold in the corner, unused this time of year. Behind a wide oak desk sat Sheriff Marcus Doyle. He was a man carved from the same mountain stone as the town itself. Broad-shouldered hair streaked silver, his jaw square and weathered. 50 years had left their lines on him, but not softened him. His voice carried the weight of gravel, low and steady. He looked up from a stack of reports as Evelyn entered his steel-gray eyes, narrowing in curiosity. "Hart," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "You've been out late." Evelyn sat back straight, the dust of the trail still clinging to her uniform. She wasted no time. She told him everything. From Storm's sudden alarm on the patrol route to the rusted cage to the foss chained inside with the cardboard sign. She spoke of Caroline's findings, the puncture marks along their spines, the faint chemical glow, the numbers carved into hooves. She spoke quietly but firmly, her words embellished the details precise. Doyle listened without interruption, one large hand tapping slowly against the desk. His eyes did not flicker, though. The muscle in his jaw tightened as she described the condition of the foss. When she finished, silence pressed between them. He leaned back, chair creaking. If what you're telling me is accurate, he said, voice rough, then this isn't some drunk rancher treating stock like scrap. This is organized. He exhaled through his nose, long and heavy. And that means trouble. Evelyn met his gaze. It's more than trouble. It's a system. We can't look the other way. Doyle droomed his fingers once more, then nodded slowly. No, we can't. But the look in his eyes was a mixture of conviction and calculation. He knew what it meant to go after a network, larger than the town's jurisdiction. The risks weren't just legal, they were personal. He pushed himself up from the desk with a grunt and crossed to the corner where an aging computer sat on a smaller table. The monitor flickered to life, humming faintly. Doyle typed with deliberate slowness, navigating into the town's security. Archives. We've got cameras at the junction near the North Trailhead, he said, and one, pointing at the old Bluff Creek Road. You said you found tire tracks. Evelyn nodded. Heavy truck, maybe 3 days old. Let's see if we get lucky. The feed scrolled through dates and times until Doyle clicked on a clip marked 3 nights back. The black and white footage was grainy, washed in the harsh glow of a sodium lamp, but the image was clear enough. A truck rolled into frame, a silver pickup with a steel cage lashed to the flatbed. The vehicle moved slow, deliberate, its tires crunching the gravel road. The driver's face was shadowed by a low-brimmed hat, but his posture, the tilt of his head, was enough to stir recognition. Earl Maddox. Doyle muttered. Evelyn leaned closer. Maddox from Bluff Creek. The sheriff's jaw hardened. That's him. Used to run horses on that ranch before it went belly up. Place has been abandoned for years, though. Abandoned. Evelyn's voice carried skepticism. The fencing around the paddocks was still intact the last time I passed by. Nobody leaves fences standing if they've really given up. Doyle grunted agreement. On screen, the driver climbed out the camera, catching his face as he glanced. Upward, wary. He wore an old leather coat stained at the cuffs and a battered fedora pulled low. Even through the static blur, the man's eyes shone with furtive calculation. He was suspected of running killer shipments out of state, Doyle said. Always found a way to slip through before charges stuck. Never caught him red-handed. Evelyn's lips pressed thin until now. They watched as Maddox wrestled with something at the back of the truck, a shape too dark to make out clearly. The steel cage glinted under the lamp. Light. Then, with visible strain, he shoved it toward the roadside brush. The camera angle caught only fragments, his coat flapping in the wind, the clatter of metal against earth. He looked around, once more, then climbed back into the cab and drove off. Evelyn's hands tightened against the edge of the desk. That's the cage, the same one I found. Doyle froze the frame, his eyes narrowing at the grainy outline of the truck. Behind them, through the window came a sharp sound, the thud of a hoof against wood. Storm. The gelding stood tied outside his press, silhouette, stark against the lamplight. He struck the porch boards again, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring. Evelyn rose, opened the door. Storm stepped inside without hesitation, hooves clattering against the floorboards. His head swung toward the screen, ears, locked body taut with recognition. A deep rumble rolled from his chest, part wicker, part growl. He slammed one hoof onto the floor, the crack echoing through the office. Evelyn laid a calming hand against his neck, but her own pulse was racing. He knows it, she said softly. That cage, the smell of it, the same compound from the sacks we found. Storm huffed hot breath, fogging the monitor. His eyes remained glued to the frozen image of the truck muscles trembling with contained energy. Doyle studied the animal, then gave a grim nod. I've trusted this horse longer than I've trusted half the men in this town, he said. If he says it's the same, that's good enough for me. The room fell into heavy silence. The hum of the computer, the only sound. Doyle walked back to his desk, poured 2 mugs of coffee from a dented thermos, and set one in front of Evelyn. He stood there a moment, his gaze hard as granite. Evelyn, he said finally, voice like gravel scraping. You've got my permission to follow this trail. But listen well, be careful. Maddox is small, fry. But the men he works for, they're bigger, meaner, and they don't just deal in horses. Evelyn lifted the mug, but her hand was steady, her eyes unwavering. I can't ignore this. We've got 3 living foes back at the station. Proof enough that this is real. Doyle leaned forward, his stare locking hers. If this grows beyond us, I'll call in the feds. But before that, I need you to give me evidence so solid it can't be buried in paperwork. Understand? She nodded. I understand. He held her gaze another long moment and finally leaned back, sipping his coffee. The lines around his mouth deepened with worry. Outside, Storm gave a low, steady whicker, as if answering for her. His body was calm now, but his eyes still burned with awareness. Evelyn rose, sliding her hat back onto her head. Then I'll bring you what you need. The office air seemed heavier, the shadows longer, the weight of the path ahead pressing on both of them. Doyle's warning was more than official. It was personal, a line drawn between trust and risk. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch. Storm snorted his breath, steaming in the cool night, and pawed once at the earth as though signaling readiness. Evelyn tightened her grip on the reins, her eyes fixed on the darkness stretching beyond town. All right, partner, she whispered. The hunt begins. Storm tossed his head mane rippling and answered with a sharp, defiant whinny that carried into the night. The moon hung like a thin blade in the sky, pale and cold above the jagged silhouette of the San Juans. Night air flowed down the ras, slopes in sharp gusts, rattling branches and carrying with it the sense of pine, pitch-damp earth, and something sharper metallic like rusted iron. Evelyn pulled her dark rares' coat tighter across her chest, the heavy fabric blending into the shadows. Storm followed close at her side, each step measured, and quiet hooves crunching softly over gravel and pine needles. His head dipped low, ears swiveling at every whisper of wind. The trail she had chosen wasn't a real road, not anymore. Years of disuse had reduced it to a faint line between the trees, hidden beneath brush and fallen timber. Most people had forgotten it even existed. Evelyn hadn't. She remembered every access trail in these hills, every fence post and cattle track from years of patrol. If Maddox still used the Bluff Creek property, this forgotten path was the least watched, the one that would deliver her to the edge of his land. Unseen, the forest pressed close. Her flashlight remained off her eyes, adjusting to the dim light. She let the crescent moon guide her, silvering the path just enough to move forward. Storm snorted once, a low puff of warning, then flicked his tail. The woods were too still. Even crickets had gone silent, as if holding their breath. They crested a ridge and paused. Below lay the Bluff Creek Ranch. Evelyn crouched low, lifting her binoculars. From a distance, the barn looked abandoned, a sagging structure of brick and tin, its roof punctured with holes and of walls streaked with mold. The windows gaped dark and broken. Weeds climbed the siding, tangling with loose boards. The image was convincing, the picture of decay. But Evelyn's eyes found the contradiction. The perimeter fence stood straight, and new heavy-gauge wire gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Steel posts had been driven deep into the ground. At the gate, a padlock shone fresh and polished, the kind sold in hardware stores just months ago. This wasn't abandonment, this was disguise. A shell of ruin meant to hide something still alive. She raised her phone, snapped a few pictures, zooming in on the lock and the fence, the trampled patches of grass, where weeds should have grown undisturbed. Storm shifted beside her, restless. Evelyn lowered the binoculars, studied the barn again. No lights burned inside. No vehicles sat in the yard. Yet she felt the weight of presence, a residual pulse of use. Someone had been here recently. Let's take a closer look, she whispered. They circled to the side, moving low, through brush until they reached the fence. Evelyn slipped her small cutter from her pack, working the lock with steady hands. The metal kicked faintly as it snapped, dropping into the grass. Storm jerked his head at the sound, nostrils flaring. He stamped, a hoof, ears pitched forward. The acrid tang of old sweat and horses clung to the air, faint but undeniable. Evelyn eased the gate open, hinges creaking softly. She guided Storm inside. The yard was overgrown with weeds, thistles high as her knees. Yet here and there the ground told another story. Patches pressed, flat soil kicked up signs of weight and recent passage. She crouched, brushing her fingers over a track. Tire, tread, days old at most. The barn loomed ahead, its corrugated roof groaning under the night wind. Evelyn approached slowly, Storm's hooves muffled in the thick weeds. She pushed against the wide door. It shifted with a squeal, opening to reveal darkness layered with dust. The air inside was stale, thick with cobwebs. At first glance, it seemed abandoned. Broken tools leaned against the walls. A wagon wheel rotted in the corner floorboards, coated in gray powder. Yet Evelyn's gaze swept the room, catching detail after detail that contradicted the illusion. A square outline in the center of the floor. Boards newer, less warped, metal handle, glinting faintly. A trap door. She crouched, brushing away dust. The handle was smooth, too smooth for something unused. recently polished by hands that opened it often. Her heart beat faster. She reached into her coat for the flashlight, thumbed it on. A weak beam cut through the dark, pooling over the hatch. Storm hissed a sharp breath, stepping back, then forward again, torn between warning and loyalty. His head swung low, ears, flat eyes wide. Evelyn steadied him with a palm against his neck. "Easy, boy, I'm right here." She grasped the handle and pulled. The hatch rose with a moan of hinges. From below surged a rush of air, cold, damp, copper, tinged. The smell of rust, the smell of blood. Evelyn swallowed, lifted the beam downward. Wooden stairs descended into shadow. Their edges worn, one cracked, through and mended with a fresh nail. This was no relic. It was a passage. Storm's hoof struck the floor sharply, a hollow echo. He lowered his head toward the opening nostrils, flaring violently. A soft, guttural noise rolled from his throat. Neither whinny nor snort, but something primal. Evelyn tightened the strap of her coat, set her jaw, and began down. Each step groaned beneath her boots. The walls closed in concrete, rising on either side, wet with condensation. Old fluorescent tubes were mounted along the corridor. Some were broken, others flickered with sickly light. The place was alive, if only barely. At the bottom, the hallway opened into a chamber. Evelyn's breath caught. Rows of iron cages lined both walls, their doors hanging open. Chains clattered faintly as the air shifted. The concrete floor was stained. In a wide, dark patches that gleamed where her light touched, old blood dried, and layered soaking into cracks. She swept the beam across. In one corner lay a heap of twisted chains and broken locks. The skeletal remains of something unmistakable. The fractured skull of a horse ribs, scattered like brittle sticks. The sight struck her chest like a hammer. She stepped closer, her throat closing. The cages bore scratches deep into the bottom, steel gouges from hooves that had fought desperately along the floor. The imprint of shoes and hooves pressed into concrete, frantic and violent. Evelyn's imagination filled the silence with sound screams. Whinnies the clang of bodies slamming metal. Storm descended carefully behind her hooves, clattering against the steps. He froze at the threshold, head tossing, breath harsh, his body tensed, muscles trembling. He pawed once at the floor, then gave a low, resonant growl, a sound she had never heard from him before. His gaze darted to the far end of the chamber where shadows thickened. Evelyn raised her light again, her boot caught against something small. She bent, lifting it into her palm. A capsule of plastic and metal, no larger than a grain of rice half-caked with grime. A microchip. Her breath quickened. She pulled the portable scanner Caroline had insisted she carry, pressed the chip against it. A faint beep, then numbers scrolled across the tiny screen. Evelyn froze as recognition sank in. She knew this code. Caroline had mentioned it before in reports of a horse that had vanished 3 years ago during a trafficking sting. A police mount. A train partner in the state patrol gone without a trace. Her hand shook as she whispered, "They're not just taking wild stock. They're stealing trained horses, law enforcement animals." The weight of it pressed down hard. This wasn't backyard cruelty, wasn't a rogue rancher trying to turn a profit. This was infrastructure, an operation so brazen it reached into the police stables. Storm's hoof struck the floor again, sharp as a gunshot. He glared at the cage's ears, pinned whole body, quivering with anger. Evelyn lifted her phone, snapping picture after picture. The cages, the stains, the bones, the microchip held between her gloved fingers. The evidence was here unignorable, carved into every surface of the chamber. She lowered the phone and rested a hand against Storm's cheek. His breath warmed, her skin still ragged. "This isn't an abandoned ranch," she whispered. "It's a ghost farm." Her words hung in the stale air, swallowed by concrete and steel. She looked again at the rows of cages, the signs of brutal struggle, the chip that tied it all to something larger. Her jaw hardened. They're breeding, training, selling them for the underground arenas. Storm lowered his head, giving a long, low whicker that vibrated through her bones, not of fear, but of mourning, of anger. His dark eyes met hers, fierce and unyielding. Evelyn slipped the chip into a bag, zipped it shut, then gripped the reins tighter. She knew with a clarity that chilled her blood that this was only the surface. Maddox wasn't the end. He was a doorway. She turned toward the stairs, Storm close, at her side. The farm above was silent, but she could feel the echo of what had once filled these halls. Desperation, pain, and a commerce that thrived in shadows. As they climbed back into the night, the wind swept hard across the clearing, rattling the tin roof until it groaned like the cry of some trapped beast. Evelyn looked once more at the falls, the ruin of Bluff Creek, and felt the path ahead sharpen into certainty. She and Storm had just stepped into a war. The ranger station was dark when Evelyn returned from Bluff Creek. Midnight air clung to her clothes, carrying the damp metallic stench of the underground cages. Storm walked beside her with his head low, silent, except for the heavy rhythm of his breathing. Neither needed words to acknowledge what they had seen. The images clung to them, both blood-stained concrete, broken chains, bones left to rot, where screams and once echoed. Inside her office, Evelyn set the evidence bag on the desk and dropped heavily into the chair. She forced herself to breathe, then opened her laptop. The sheriff had once given her access to a secure federal line. Only if you ever find something too big for this town, Doyle had said. Tonight it was time. The screen flickered, then resolved into the face of Agent Rosa Navarro. She was younger than Evelyn had expected when they first met years ago at a joint wildlife trafficking seminar, early 30 Latina sharp-boned features and sharper eyes. She wore her dark hair tied back in a tight knot headset looped around one ear. Even through the grainy video, Rosa radiated restless energy. A woman accustomed to juggling multiple cases, none of them simple. Ranger Hart, Rosa said, her voice clipped, but not unkind. Your message said, errant. Evelyn slid photos into view. The underground, kennels, the rusted chains, the heap of bones, and finally the microchip she had. Scanned. The numbers were clear, damning. Found in Bluff Creek, Maddox's property, and hidden chamber. Fresh signs of use, and this registered to a police horse that vanished 3 years ago. Rosa leaned forward. For a moment, her face betrayed something rare relief, mixed with anger. I've been waiting for evidence like this, she said. We always knew Darnell's ring was operating in your corridor, but local reports were too thin. This, she exhaled. This is different. This ties it straight to federal property. A canine mount is a government asset. That puts him square in our jurisdiction. Evelyn rubbed a hand over her eyes, exhaustion pressing at her skull. So, Maddox is working for Darnell? Yes, Rosa replied without hesitation. Maddox is a middleman. He runs transport, provides cover stories, makes things look like sloppy ranch work. He's been in and out of suspicion for years, but he's never smart enough to orchestrate the whole thing. The brain is Lyle Darnell. The name chilled the room. Rosa continued her words. Brisk, precise. Darnell runs a cross-state network. Mustangs from federal land, discarded. Ratia horses, stolen stock, sometimes even trained patrol mounts. He has buyers in underground fighting arenas, private collectors overseas, and cartel clients who want horses trained to respond to coded commands. He keeps himself insulated, never at the scene, never touching the animals directly. Every time we get close, he sheds a layer of men and comes out clean. Evelyn frowned, and the microchip proves he's crossing the line, taking horses from law enforcement. Rosa's eyes burned. Exactly. That's theft of government property. That makes him untouchable no longer. Storm shifted in the shadows behind Evelyn's desk, stamping a hoof as if he too understood the weight of the revelation. Evelyn turned slightly, brushing her fingers along his muzzle, then faced Rosa again. If he's bold enough to steal trained mounts, he won't stop. He'll escalate. That's why we're moving now, Rosa said. She leaned closer, voice lowering. We've got intel, a shipment, a sale. Evelyn's pulse quickened. When? In 3 days? Underground auction warehouse on the county border. Invitation only. Darnell won't be there himself, but his trainer, Colt Rayner, will. Maddox too. They'll be moving at least 20 head. Evelyn swallowed hard. 20. Rosa nodded grimly. We can't just raid and hope for scraps. We need eyes inside. Evidence. Buyers. Sellers. Money exchanging hands. That's how we nail them. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And what's my part? You and your horse, Rosa said plainly. You'll go imposing as a seller. Beat up tack. A tired animal for trade. Maddox knows you, but he won't expect you in that crowd. Storm will draw attention, but in the right way. Horses recognize each other. If Storm reacts to Rayner or Maddox, that's confirmation we can't. Fake. Evelyn's chest tightened. The thought of Storm inside that place, surrounded by cages and chains, made her stomach churn. She shook her head. I'm not putting him at risk like that. Rosa's gaze softened, but only a fraction. Listen, I don't say this lightly, but Storm is more than a horse, and you know it. He can sense what you can't. If Maddox handled that cage, Storm will remember. If Raynor touched those foes, Storm will know. Without him, we're just guessing. Storm flicked his ears at the sound of their voices. He stepped forward until his head filled part of the camera frame, breathing a low whicker. Evelyn glanced at him. His eyes were steady, dark pools reflecting her own conflict. He stamped once as though giving his answer. Evelyn exhaled slowly. He'd go with me, even if I tried to stop him. Rosa's lips curved into a thin, approving smile. Then, we have a plan. The next hours blurred into preparation. Evelyn printed her photographs, labeled each with coordinates and notes. She uploaded the chip data encrypted, sent it to Rosa's server. Every keystroke felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of Bluff Creek's cover. On the other end, Rosa coordinated her team. "We'll go in disguised as buyers," she said over the headset, her voice calm amid the flurry of typing. "Different factions, different pockets. Cartel reps, collectors, mercenaries. They'll expect diversity. We blend in." Evelyn sorted through her tack trunk. She pulled out the oldest bridle she owned, leather-cracked res patched with twine. She found a faded saddle blanket with frayed edges. Storm's gleaming coat would betray his strength, but she could dull the shine with dust and mud, make him look worn. ASB been turned to barter. She hated the thought, but it was necessary. Rosa's voice carried through the static. "We'll have surveillance vans within a mile. SWAT staged farther, waiting for my signal. But inside, it's just us until the deal breaks open," Evelyn muttered, "just like walking into a snare." "That's the point," Rosa replied. Storm nudged Evelyn's shoulder as she worked his breath warm against her skin. She glanced at him, forcing a smile. "You ready to play the part of a tired old nag?" Storm snorted, tossing his head as if insulted by the suggestion. Evelyn chuckled once, a short release of tension. She packed the rest with care: flashlight, camera, pliers, a coil of rope. At the bottom of the bag, she placed the folder: photographs, chip, data, written, testimony. If something happened to her, the evidence would remain. When she zipped it shut, Rosa's face appeared again on the screen. "One last thing, Hart. This isn't a typical auction. These aren't ranchers. They're armed, paranoid, and backed by cartel money. They will kill to keep it quiet." Evelyn paused, hand on Storm's reins. Her eyes hardened, her voice steady. "I've seen the bones in Bluff Creek. If I turn my back, there will be more. I'm not turning away." Rosa gave a short nod. "Then I'll see you at the warehouse." The call ended. Silence filled the station, broken only by the soft rustle of hay outside. Evelyn looked at Storm, his gray coat, gleaming faintly in the shaft of moonlight through the window. The scar along his flank caught the light, a pale reminder of the fire they had survived together. She reached out, pressed her palm against the warm line of his neck. "Looks like we're heading deeper, old boy." Storm lowered his head, gave a long rumbling sigh, then stamped once against the floorboards. The moon climbed higher, painting the world in silver. In its glow, the Ranger and her horse stood side by side, preparing for a road that would lead them into the very heart of darkness. The dirt road to the warehouse was a ribbon of dust and shadow. Headlights from the occasional long haul, the truck slid across the hills and disappeared, leaving the night hollow again. Evelyn kept her hat brim low and her posture loose, the way traders did when too many miles had scuffed the pride out of them. She had dressed Storm in cracked leather and a sun-faded saddle blanket, rubbed a little mud into his dapples, and dulled the shine on his coat. It pained her the pretense of neglect, but she reminded herself the camouflage was sometimes mercy. Rosa drove quiet and focused, a battered pickup borrowed from an evidence lot. A hard-sided case sat between them, latched and ugly, a prop full of FBI training bills, and a few real notes salted in for texture. Rosa's eyes flicked to the rear view as the warehouse came into view. A slab-sided rectangle of corrugated metal, on the county line, ringed with chain link and shadow. One floodlight sputtered over the entrance like a failing lighthouse. "Remember," Rosa said softly, "follow, don't lead, let them talk. We'll be inside with at least 3 teams posing as buyers. When it breaks, it breaks. Fast." Evelyn nodded. Storm's ear brushed her wrist. "We're ready." At the gate, a man, with a clipboard and a knife on his belt, stepped out of the gloom. He examined the case, took a long look at Storm, and snorted. "Seen worse," he muttered. then jerked his chin toward the door. Inside. Keep your mouth shut and your money visible. They were swallowed by the warehouse. Inside, the ceiling soared above a maze of shadows and light. Fluorescents hung, in rows, but only some worked. A few flickered, others hummed. Together, they turned the air a sickly yellow. Along both walls, cages were banked in iron grids high as a man's chest. Horses stood inside them, heads lowered, tails limp. No impatient stamping, no high, calling across the space, only the whisper of breathing and the churn of industrial fans that pushed the smell of sweat medicine and manure in sluggish currents. Evelyn's throat tightened. Storm stopped dead for a heartbeat, taking everything in, then stepped forward at her touch. She let her gaze move without lingering. A knot of men in long coats mumbled over. A bank envelope. Two others' faces swallowed by hoodies, counted cash and made marks on a notepad. No one laughed. No one wanted attention. Storm's ears flicked and fixed. He lifted his head nostrils, quivering as though chasing a scent he'd half remembered in a nightmare. Evelyn eased him toward the right hand. Aisle. She kept one hand on the res, the other on the pelican case. Rosa drifted away, blending into a cluster of supposed buyer's hair tucked into a cap, a gold chain catching the light. The portrait of someone who had come for meat or muscle or both. At the far end, a rough platform had been built from pallets and plywood, a microphone bolted to a stand whose base was patched with duct tape. The man who took the mic moved like he owned the room, tall, raw. Boned, a coil of snake inked up one arm to his shoulder. His hair was buzzed short. A scar cut his lip in a hooked smile. Evening, he said, voice harsh and confident. The chief PA threw his words against the metal walls. Name's Colt Renner. You came. Shopping, I came supplying. Everything here is prepped. First tier response. You want obedience. You want speed. You want quiet, pay for it. A ripple of cold laughter passed through the crowd. Not joy, just greed stretching its legs. Numbers flashed on paddles. A man near. The rear raised a hand and let it fall like he was swatting a fly. Colt nodded to two handlers. They disappeared into the line of cages and returned, dragging a small bay filly. She stumbled rope, cutting her mouth legs, going loose beneath her. Willow's size. Willow's fragility. Willow's eyes. Lot 9, Colt said. He didn't look at the filly when he said it. Responds to voice, responds to light, cross-checked, on flooring changes and crowd noise. Watch. He turned toward her and snapped a command, Spanish, sharp and hard. Quieto. The filly froze. Not just a stop of hooves. Every muscle locked at once. She held her breath like a swimmer below a dark surface. A tremor passed through her flanks, and she smothered it. Rosa slid near Evelyn's shoulder like a shadow. That isn't training, she murmured. That's conditioning under fear. Evelyn's jaw clenched until it AHAC-D. They're teaching them for cartel runs, she whispered back. Silent, coded, obedient, under threat. On the platform, Colt showed a cruel smile as if he'd made a tricked dog roll over. He lifted a hand, opening bid. Beside Evelyn, Storm shifted. The cords of muscle in his neck tightened under her palm. Colt barked. The Spanish command again, like a whip crack. Storm slammed a forehoof into the concrete. The sound cracked through the warehouse and ricocheted off the high roof like a pistol shot. Head swung, someone cursed. Storm threw his head and let loose a long, furious whinny that rolled the length of the cages. Horses lifted their faces as if pulled by a string. 1, then 5, then all up in alert. A few whickered in answer, thin at first, then rising, as if remembering the language they'd been punished for speaking. Colt's eyes snapped down the aisle. He saw the gray with the ragged saddle blanket and the scar along his flank. He saw the woman beside him with the dust on her hat and the steady eyes. Recognition hit his face like a throne. Stone. Half a flinch, half a snarl. Evelyn felt the moment change. The cover had a heartbeat left, maybe two. Rose's shoulder touched hers. He knows. She breathed. We need to move. I know, Evelyn said. Colt leaned into the mic like he was about to make a joke. Instead, he dropped it. The squeal of feedback tore the air. He pushed away from the podium and bolted toward a side door. The handlers lurching after him, confused. Go, Evelyn said to Storm. Not loud, not dramatic, just a word honed to an inetus edge. Storm launched. The aisle exploded around them. A row of cages rattled hard as horses banged and turned. Buyers shouted and scrambled as the gray shot forward iron shoes, striking sparks from a strip of exposed rebar. Rosa's voice crackled in Evelyn's ear from the concealed mic. Target moving side exit. North wall teams 1 and 2 collapse. Now Colt hit the door with his shoulders, shoved it open, and vanished into a narrow hall. Storm blew through the gap in the crowd, the bad saddle squealing, as his stride lengthened. A guard reached for a pistol. Rosa was on him in a blink, her gun out of nowhere, low and level. "Don't," she said, and the man froze as if someone had shouted the Spanish word at him. The warehouse came apart. Money flew from an open case and fluttered like dead leaves. Chairs skidded and fell. A set of cage pins corroded and old sheared loose under the pounding of hooves. A door swung wide, and a big sorrel shouldered out into the aisle. Nostrils flared. Somewhere another pin failed, then another. The air thickened with dust and straw. The light stuttered. Evelyn bent low over Storm's neck as they surged into the corridor. A world squeezing into a tunnel of gray metal and breath and pursuit. Colt's boots hammered the concrete ahead. He looked back once, misjudged the corner, and slammed a shoulder into the wall. He hit the crash bar at the end and burst into a loading bay under a sputtering floodlight. Cold night slapping his face. He cut right toward a stack of pallets and a half, rolled door. Storm came out of the hall like a shell from a gun. Evelyn braced and lifted the reins. Up Storm rose front legs, striking his body, a wall of furious muscle. Colt threw an arm over his face as the horse came down, and the shock of Storm's chest blocked him against the roll-up door. He staggered and swung a whip that had been coiled at his waist. Leather snapped across Storm's shoulder. The gray flinched and then drove forward with his weight again, a shudder through his frame like thunder rolling down a canyon. Evelyn slid from the saddle before the second strike. She hit the ground, grabbed Colt's wrist, turned with his momentum, and took him down. The whip clattered away. He tried to roll. She pinned him with a knee between his shoulder blades and brought his arm up until the ligaments. Shrieked. "You're done," she said, breath steady. He spat blood and laughter. "You think this is the market, sweetheart? This is the clearance rack. Where's the warehouse that isn't clearance?" His smile was all teeth. "Harper's Bluff." He wheezed. "You'll be late. You're always late." "Not tonight," Rosa said, appearing over his shoulder with 2 agents who hauled him up and snapped cuffs on his wrists. One agent dug into Colt's jacket and came up with a hard plastic tracker about the size of a deck of cards, screening an arrow and a coordinate flashing when tapped. "Vehicle GPS," the agent said. Evelyn looked to Rosa. Rosa looked to Evelyn. It didn't require words. Back. Inside, the auction was dissolving. FBI buyers had their guns out, and their badges up now. The knot of guards was disarmed and face down. Horses milled in. Narrow aisles blowing and turning. Evelyn swung back into Storm and kneed him carefully through the chaos voice. "Low. Easy, easy." She turned his head toward the loading bay. In the bare buzzing light, Storm's eyes had gone fierce, not wild, but bright, with a purpose that had outlasted fear. He stamped once hard like a judge's gavel. Rosa's radio crackled alive. She gave clipped orders. Coordinates a rendezvous. "We move," she told Evelyn. "Now." Harper's Bluff was larger by far, a distribution hub, not a storefront. They cut their headlights a mile out and crept in low road dust, turning to a fine chalk that coated lips and teeth. SWAT trucks idled in the black behind a line of scrub trees. Men and women ghosted in and out of the gloom, buckling helmets, checking plates on vests, clicking safeties. The warehouse itself hulked in a basin below, ringed with floodlights and bare earth scoured by tires. Rosa summarized in a whisper no louder than a prayer. 3 entry teams. North, door loading dock roof breach. We hit on my count. We prioritize the animals then, the people. If it moves toward a weapon, you stop it. Evelyn adjusted the strap over her shoulder and stroked Storm's cheek. "You ready, old man?" He breathed against her palm. The sound felt like yes, the first. Lock went with a muffled snap and a hiss of cutters through chain. A door rolled, upward, heavy, and slow. The smell that poured out was foul enough to make Evelyn's eyes water urine, blood, disinfectant fear. It was the smell of the Bluff Creek cellar multiplied until it became a weather system. They moved in, rows upon rows of cages, tighter than the first place stacked in 2s in some aisles. The horses inside wore their misery like blankets. Scars cross-hatched their flank sores, crusted around halters that had never been loosened. eyes dull from too many nights without rest. A few turned their heads and tried to look at the intruders over their shoulder bars. Most didn't move at all. Team 2 left, Team 3 right. Rosa's voice clicked. Mark the injured. Start opening as soon as lanes are secure. Evelyn didn't realize she was holding her breath until she heard a sound that wasn't boots or orders. A hair-thin wicker that cut straight through the noise. She spun her light. In the far row, 3 small cages were bolted side by side. A black foe lifted his head, eyes bright, even in exhaustion. A bigger colt lay with his sides working, like bellows. And in the last cage, a small filly stood so close to the bars, her nose pressed against them, trying to push through. Ashlyn, said the name, leaving her mouth, without permission. Blaze Willow. Storm's head snapped toward the sound of his own voice catching in her throat. He surged forward until his muzzle was against the bars, and the 3 foes answered him. Sounds too soft to be called, calls too full to be silence. They fumbled to their feet all at once, knees quaking, and the little filly bumped the iron, rubbing her face into Storm's nose as if trying to climb in him. Here! Evelyn shouted to the nearest team. Here now! Cutters flashed. A latch screamed and broke. Agents pulled back the door, and Ash spilled forward into Storm's chest, nearly knocking himself down in his hurry. Blah One tried to step and caught a hoof on the lip. The agent lifted and freed him. Willow came last because she was shaking, and because she kept trying to touch Storm and move at the same time. From the next cage, a full-grown mare cried out, a sound so raw it made heads jerk up. The mare threw her weight against her door, teeth-bared eyes rolling. She lunged again higher, as if she could will iron to bend. Mom, Evelyn breathed. That's her. Open it, Rosa ordered. The door gave with a crack, like a branch breaking. The mare burst free and drove straight for Willow. The little filly vanished in her chest and neck, practically disappearing under the mare's chin. Storm stepped back and bowed his head, as if some old code demanded its space for the mother to reclaim what had been torn. Other doors were opening now, all across the building. A big Ran stepped out and shook mane, scattering dust like snow. Black with a scar along his shoulder, cringed from an agent's hand, then edged forward and sniffed it. Anyway, down the center aisle, a pair of guards charged, swinging batons and shouting, a SWAT. An officer took one to the floor with a shoulder and pinned him. The second went down under a tangle of arms and cuffs. Evelyn swung into the saddle because there was only one way to move this many. The horses through this narrow a maze with a leader they would follow. She stood in her stirrups and whistled a spart, low-rising trill. Storm answered with a bugle that filled the warehouse like sunrise. On me, Evelyn called. On me, on me. It started with 10, then 15. The sound of Storm's hooves became a drum. The others locked to an old rhythm horses knew in their bones. They began to move as one body: step, turn, wait, step, turn, wait. As agents, cut doors and swung them wide, and pulled pins and cursed at locks that refused to give. At a choke point near the loading bay, someone hit a breaker. The flood. Light over the door sputtered, then steadied a white rectangle opening on the night beyond. Storm lifted his head as if the moon had just risen there. He drove forward at a trot, and Evelyn felt more than saw the swell of bodies behind them. Now, she said into the mic. Now, Rosa, let them go. Let them go, Rosa repeated to every team in the building. Storm reached the threshold and struck the concrete with his fore, like a judge calling order. Then he leapt into the dark, and the herd poured after him. The sound swallowed, thought iron on, concrete breath, tearing the snapping of thin metal as cages surrendered to force they'd never been built to resist. Air hit them cold and hard. Dust boiled around legs like river silt. Evelyn guided them not toward the road, but toward the open slope beyond the loading dock, a gentler grade where even the weakest could climb. Behind the warehouse, groaned under the sudden emptiness of its sins. In the door, Rosa stood with her gun down at her side, and her other hand up, counting heads, the way a teacher counts children at the fire. Drill. She smiled without any joy at all, and then turned to shout more orders. No one could hear in the thunder. On the ridge, Evelyn slowed Storm. He came down to a canter, then a jog, then a prancing, snorting walk. Rein, light, and neck arched. The mares gathered their foes. Geelings shouldered one another into order. Somewhere a horse started to graze. Because grass was grass, and the world still worked. Evelyn patted Storm's neck, and he blew, steam curling out in the cold like breath from a furnace. Below, the scene tightened back into the law and inventory. Agents cuffed men on their faces and dragged them to knees. SWAT moved room to room with the blunt patience of people who understood how quickly triumph turns to tragedy. Sirens approached from highways like wolves howling far away. Evelyn slid from the saddle and let Storm graze, though his head stayed high and his ears kept swiveling. Ash crept to his shoulder, and Storm dropped his nose to the colt's mane and breathed him in like he was memorizing. Him. Blah One planted his big head against Storm's shoulder and side-eyed. Willow stood with her nose tucked under her mother's jaw, eyes closed. Rosa came up the slow pair loose, now. Sweat streaked across her brow, a bruise blooming along one cheekbone where someone's elbow had found her in the melee. She looked like a woman who had seen something she could not unsee and chosen to look anyway. "We did it," she said, not triumph so much as relief. "We just broke one of Darnell's biggest barns." Evelyn's hand rested on Storm's withers. "He'll build another if he can, maybe," Rosa said, "but he'll have to do it with fewer men and less money and with a lot more eyes on him." She looked at the three Faws, her expression softening the way granite softens in rain. "They'll need care. Weeks, months. They'll have it," Evelyn said. "They'll have us." Rosa nodded. "I'll get transport rolling." She glanced at Storm, then at Evelyn, and the line of her mouth bent into something like gratitude. "I don't think we pull this off without Evelyn ran her fingers through the gray's coarse mane. "I don't pull anything off without him." A breeze lifted cool and clean, as if it had blown straight down from high country snow. It washed the stink of the warehouse from their clothes and carried it away to someplace small and forgettable. Below, metal clanged and radios chattered and chains rattled one final time before they were tossed into a bin and marked for evidence. Evelyn looked back at the black maw of the door and then at the open slope in the sky. "We're done here," she told Storm, and he shook his neck like he understood endings. As they turned toward the road, Ash trotted in a jittery arc, testing the spring in his legs without the weight of iron on them. Blah One bumped him like a brother does. Willow stumbled and righted, and then lifted her feet a little higher, as if the ground had become a softer story. They were not healed, not yet, but they were moving toward it. And under the thin stars, with the smell of cedar rising and the wide night making room for them, that was enough to feel like victory. Morning came with headlines. Evelyn woke to a Halfazen alerts buzzing across her phone, each one a variation on the same shock. A local reporter had published hidden footage from the underground auction. The byline read, "Emily Crane." The video opened on the plywood stage, Colt Renner and his snake-inked swagger handlers jerking terrified horses into the cone of a swinging work light. Then the camera widened and held faces. In the crowd, resolving out of shadow men with money men with badges, a councilman from a nearby town who'd campaigned on protecting our heritage, a deputy from a neighboring county looking everywhere, but at the animals. No narration, no editorializing, just proof. By noon, the story had leapt from the valley to Denver. Television anchors spoke in grave tones, radio hosts fumed, social feeds filled with the raw, shaky frames of a filly freezing under a Spanish order, and the gray horse in the aisle, throwing his head and breaking the spell. Comment sections, usually a canyon of noise, tilted almost entirely one way. Outrage, donations flowed to rescues across the state as if a dam had burst. The governor's office released a statement before dusk. A multi-agency task force would audit every impound lot killer pipeline and auction house from the plateau to the plains. Maddox was picked up that night on a county road, his truck still smelling faintly of the same chemical powder Storm had hated. 3 handlers were cuffed behind the warehouse, 2 guards in a motel, a buyer with blood on his sleeve at a truck stop. Paper trails once scattered and deniable began to align under federal pressure. Lyle Darnell remained a rumor in a suit, never at the scene, never on a manifest. But for the first time in years, the network he'd built shuddered like a web cut at a dozen strands. Evelyn read the latest update in the below quiet of the ranger station, the morning cold seeping through the floorboards. Storm stood at the door, his head half in the room, watching her, as if he understood the significance of a screen only in how it changed her face. She exhaled and set the phone down, palm flat on the desk to steady herself. At least, she said into the room, into the day. They're not locking up any more lives here. Storm lowered his head and blew a warm breath over her shoulder as if to second it. The sanctuary days began small. In the fenced pasture behind the station, the world was uncomplicated. Grass, water, sun, wind. Ash stood at the margins of that simple world, shadowing the fence line like a sentry. He would test the air before each sip, ears pricking at every flicker of movement, an elk in the distance, a hawk's shadow rolling across the hill. He never bolted, not anymore. He simply watched, and then, after a pause that grew shorter each day, bent his head to drink. When Evelyn approached with a brush, he held himself taut for the first strokes, then unwound by degrees, eyes softening as if a fist in his chest were finally loosening. Blah One discovered joy the way some horses discover salt by accident, and then with appetite. Within a week, he had made a game out of everything that wasn't nailed down. He invented a loop through the pasture, a brisk trot past the water tub, a kick of the heels at the lone cottonwood, a dramatic skid to halt near Storm, as if to say, "Did you see?" He chased his own shadow, then Ash's patience, then the blue plastic ball Caroline brought as a test of curiosity. He bumped noses with the neighbor's old mare over the fence, and came away looking like a boy who'd gathered and secret. Willow was slower. The first days she lived, tucked under her mother's neck, so close she could breathe inside the mare's breath. Any sudden sound door slam ATV backfire on the road sent a tremor through her that traveled from ear to tail. But fear has a rhythm, and rhythms can be replaced. Storm did the replacing. He became the teacher without ever being asked. He showed the three where the sweet grass grew just beyond the patch of sage, where every afternoon a breeze slid down from the peak. He led them to the shallow end of the creek and stamped once splashing until Blah One decided water might be a toy. When a gust came out of nowhere and rattled the gate, Storm stepped forward first, not with a stiff neck or flared eyes, but with an ordinary, unremarkable calm. He stood between the noise and the foes, breathed, then turned to them with that minimal tilt of the head horses use between friends. "It's nothing, trust me." Willow watched, trembling less each time, and tried on the reflex for herself. Evelyn kept her distance more often than not, at least during the lessons. She watched from the fence rail with her fingers wrapped around the wood and her heart wrapped around the view. She still had reports to file and phone calls to answer and officials to shepherd through the facts. But every hour she could steal belonged to this quiet choreography. The way Ash's suspicious gaze became thoughtful. On the way, Blah One learned to listen between sprints. The way Willow's little wicker answered Storm's rumble across an afternoon. "They're doing it," she said to Caroline one evening as the vet checked Willow's injection sites with gentle hands. "They're making themselves again." "They're being allowed to," Caroline corrected, softly and patted Willow's neck. The town gathered a week later in the square because some stories required an ending, with voices, even if the work was not done. Silver Mesa had strung cheap bunting between the light poles. Someone had dragged a portable speaker onto the courthouse steps. The bakery donated a pyramid of cinnamon rolls that disappeared before the speeches began. Children ran underfoot. Old ranchers leaned on the same opinions they always would, but even they were quiet when the horses arrived. Evelyn walked Storm down the center lane while the crowd parted. He wore a clean bridle and nothing else. No saddle, no insignia, just the coat that scarred. Fire had not managed to take, and the eye that had learned to be both hard and kind. Ash, Blaze, and Willow followed with halters and loose ropes held by volunteers. The mother May stayed close enough to touch the filly. Sheriff Marcus Doyle stood at the top of the steps in his dress uniform. The man, who often looked like granite now, looked like someone who had seen granite crack, and it had rearranged him some. He cleared his throat, not for effect, but out of necessity. "Folks," he began, "I can't remember the last time we stood here to thank a horse." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. It wasn't disrespect, just relief. Doyle's voice warmed. "Not every guardian walks on two legs. Not every oath is sworn with a hand on a book. Sometimes it's kept with a hoof in the dirt, and a choice to stand in front of what's coming." He looked at Storm, not like a man, addressing an animal, but like one acknowledging another sentinel. "This town owes its thanks to Ranger Hart for bringing the truth into daylight. And we owe our peace this week and the ones ahead to the gray who refused to look away." He opened a small velvet box and lifted out a medallion round brass. The town. Crest etched at the center, the words "Guardian of the Wild Ridge" chased along the edge. He held it to the sunlight for a heartbeat before stepping down. "Easy," Evelyn murmured, and Storm stilled as if he had understood the ceremony before it was explained. Doyle fastened the medallion to a leather tab at Storm's bridle. No pin, nothing. Sharp, nothing that would bite into skin. The metal flashed once. Murmurs. moved through the crowd like a gust in wheat. A woman in the second row dabbed her eyes. A baker in a flour-dusted apron applauded first. Others followed, until the square filled with a sound that was not a roar, but something steadier: recognition and gratitude. Evelyn stood with one hand at Storm's cheek, the other cupped around the medallion to keep it from swinging against his face. She hadn't figured out what to do with the wet in her own eyes, so she didn't. She just breathed. From near the front, a small voice tried and failed to clear the last of its nerves. "Excuse me." People parted. A girl of 9, maybe 10, stepped forward with both hands wrapped around a simple leather collar. The collar had been cut and stitched. From a belt and a scrap of rain, where a buckle should have been a brass ring, had been knotted in with twine. The letters on the leather were uneven, cut by a hand that had not done such work before. Guardian. Evelyn recognized her first, the freckled face, the braid too tight, the way the girl held herself like she might collapse or fly. She was the child Storm had pulled from a thin crack of canyon last winter, when a family hike had turned into a search. Grid and a race against snow. The girl swallowed. "I made this for him," she said, voice small but not weak. Because he's a hero." Evelyn crouched so they were eye to eye. "He'll be honored to wear it. Would you put it on him?" The girl nodded like the world depended on her not messing it up. She moved to Storm's shoulder and waited. He lowered his head until his chin nearly brushed her hair. With Evelyn's fingers guiding her, she slipped the collar over the bridle strap, settled it against Storm's thick neck, and patted it once like a promise. Storm breathed out a soft sound and nudged her shoulder with the care of a creature who understood how easily a present in dollars child could tip. She laughed a quick, bright sound, and the square went silent for a second, as if everyone wanted to hear what joy sounded like in this place. Then the applause came again, not louder, just deeper. Weeks later, the formal work wore on. Interviews and affidavit, seized ledgers becoming maps, a grand jury hearing, names whispered for years. Rosa called it odd hours with updates. Darnell remained a shadow that moved when you looked straight at it. The ring was not dead, it was wounded, and wounded things are dangerous. But Silver Mesa did not live only in the case anymore. It lived also in a new patch of pasture, fenced by posts Evelyn sunk with her own hands. They called it a commons, because calling it a sanctuary felt like daring fate. The fence was plain wood rails, no barbed wire, no hot strand sturdy enough to say you're safe, open enough to say you're free. The gate latched but did not lock. A latch was for wind, a lock for fear, and Evelyn had sworn there would be no fear. Here. Above the gate, she hung a plank. She'd planed herself, and burned with a cold soldering iron until the letters came black and clean. Here you are, not for sale. The first day she swung the gate wide. Ash hesitated, looking from pasture to horizon and back, as if there had to be a catch. Blawan bounced in place like a drum beat, trying to roll into a gallop. Willow pressed against her mother, then stole 2 steps forward, and looked back the way a child does at the edge of a racked pool. Storm walked in first, not too fast, as if showing them that the ground they'd been given wasn't a trick. They followed Ash at his shoulder now, Blaze darting ahead, Willow tucked between Storm and the mayor. The rules wrote themselves. Storm patrolled the fence line in long, easy arcs at dawn and dusk, as if the perimeter needed a narrative. Sometimes he paused at the crest and looked out over the valley, the 2-lane ribbon, the grain silos, the church steeple, then back at the pasture, like he was measuring the distance between danger and home. Volunteers came to muck and mend. Caroline stopped by with vaccines and peppermints. Kids drew pictures and taped them to the station door. Horses with too many legs, horses with hero capes, horses with speech, Bubbles saying, "Thank you." Evelyn stood in the gate sometimes and touched the sign with her fingertips as if to remind herself it wasn't a dream. "We traded pain for this," she said once to no one in particular. "That's a fair bargain." Evelyn's voice was low, but carried like an oath. Storm flicked an ear, as if he understood and agreed, his breath spilling white into the brittle autumn night. The full moon rose fat and pale, pouring silver light across the pasture, gilding the frost-tipped grass until it gleamed like shards of glass. From the rust-eaten cage beneath the pines, 3 foals stepped out on shaky legs. Ash gave a soft, throaty whicker and sidestepped with the grace of a dancer. Bly darted after his own shadow, hooves scratching crescents in the frozen earth. Willow, small and hesitant, pressed under her mother's chin then, with a trembling courage, took 5 fragile steps into the open field. At the gate, Evelyn called softly, "Willow." The filly lifted her head. A faint, certain cry carried farther than it should have in the cold night air, as if the mountain itself was listening. Storm stood tall beside the gate, the worn leather collar the little girl had once tied around his neck, glinting dully against his brass medallion. For a heartbeat, he no longer seemed like the broken horse someone once tried to tame by force, but exactly what Doyle had named him, a sentinel posted on the border between harm and home. Evelyn leaned against the post, letting the silence sink into her bones. She did not think of affidavits, or coordinates, or the court dates looming ahead. She tried not to think of Darnell's shadow still moving somewhere beyond the ridge. Tonight, there was only breath-warm clouds drifting into the frost-bitten air, the crunch of Storm's hooves pressing into the silver earth, the mare's low murmur to Willow, answered by the filly's tender whinny. The crowd, the trial, the lies, all of it faded into memory. This was the life they had fought to carve out, fragile, unpriced, but real. A sudden gust swept down from the mountains. It rattled the old wooden sign on the gate. The board groaned as though clearing its throat, and the words Evelyn had burned with steady hands glimmered under the moonlight. "Here, you are not for sale." Storm's ears pricked forward. His eyes locked on the tree line, body taut with an alertness Evelyn had learned to trust. She placed her hand under his jaw, leaning her forehead to his. "Guard us, Storm," she whispered, "and we'll guard the truth." Then crack. A branch snapped in the shadows beyond the fence. Evelyn's breath froze in her chest. For an instant she saw it, a figure watching from the darkness, eyes catching the moon like a blade's edge. By the time she blinked, the figure was gone. The wind fell still. The foals went on playing as though nothing had happened. But deep inside, Evelyn knew. This battle wasn't over. The forest still kept secrets, and someone out there was waiting to silence her before she could speak.